All right, so let me get into the ancient Kush portion of these Egypt Middle and New Kingdom notes. First of all, Kush and Nubia, that is the same ancient land. So sometimes in history it's referred to as Kush, sometimes it's referred to as Nubia. And the area that this civilization was in is what is today Sudan over here. So you can see just to the south of Egypt. So here would be Lower Egypt, here would be Upper Egypt, and then way over here is the kingdom of Kush, or sometimes referred to as the kingdom of Nubia. Now, we don't know as much about Kush as we do ancient Egypt. And the reason that is the case has to do with racism. So let me explain what I mean by that. In the early 1900s, that's when the study of Egypt and Egyptology and mummies and pyramids and pharaohs and seeing things in a sarcophagus become very, very lucrative, meaning an archaeologist could get paid to go on a dig to hunt for Egyptian artifacts. He could find those Egyptian artifacts and then can sell them to a museum. Now, there were a bunch of archaeologists working in Egypt and a few archaeologists that wanted to head down to Kush. They were basically rivals, like the archaeologists that were going to go to Kush. The reason they checked there is they were like, there's a lot of people checking in Egypt for things. I'm going to go down to Sudan and see what's there. And the people that found the stuff in Egypt decided, if we make Egypt seem superior, the museums won't want anything from Kush, because if we talk up that Kush didn't do anything, they're a useless civilization. These are the archaeologists' words, not mine. They are uncivilized. These archaeologists said that they could get more for their Egyptian artifacts. The reason this is connected to race is when we talk about Kush and Sudan, we're talking about Black people. And it's the documented kind of quieting of the history of Kush in an effort to make these archaeologists more money from the museums. So the good news is there is a lot of archaeologists trying to change that today, but they have some hurdles. So as I said, Kush is in what is today Sudan, down over here. And the problem is Sudan doesn't have money like Egypt has money. So the Egyptian government does a lot to protect these artifacts and make deals with big time organizations like National Geographic and the BBC and all these things. Sudan doesn't have that kind of outreach, those kind of resources. And you would think like, well, why doesn't National Geographic or the BBC or anyone else do the research for the good of learning and civilization? Well, the problem is some of the tombs are underwater. The Nile River has flooded. That's a whole nother story, where when Egypt built their dam system, it actually created more floods in Sudan. But a lot of the ancient sites of Kush are underwater, which costs way more money, and the stuff has been damaged a lot more. So let's focus now on what Kush was like in ancient times, from what we do know. And like I said, this is a civilization we're learning more about each year. So Kush and Egypt actually had a major influence on each other. It is said that Kush even built pyramids for their kings, just like Egypt. Now, not as big as the Great Pyramid of Giza, but still pyramids of a sizable, come out. When the Hyksos attacked Egypt, you'll remember the Hyksos come in with their chariots, with their better weapons. Kush got a little nervous that the Hyksos would attack them as well. So the Hyksos and Kush kind of make a deal. Kush agreed not to help Egypt in trying to defeat the Hyksos. And the Hyksos said, whatever trade deal you had with Egypt, we're going to honor that trade deal. Like, we're in charge now, but we're going to keep those materials going back and forth between Egypt and Kush, as long as you don't help Egypt try and overthrow us. So, as you learned, the Egyptians rebel years later. Ahmose leads the rebellion. And when he gets rid of the Hyksos, he decides to attack Kush. And here's why. The Egyptians felt Kush had betrayed them. They felt that Kush chose the Hyksos over Egypt. So Ahmose is like, it's time for revenge. Kush, on the other hand, had a different perspective. They felt that if they did try and help the Egyptians, they would lose too because the Hyksos had the better weapons. So they were kind of looking out for themselves and took the trade deal. Well, the battle and conflict between Egypt and Kush, these neighboring lands, lasts for about 90 years. And the way it worked is like every new kingdom pharaoh, with some exceptions, took over like a little bit by bit of Kush. The pharaoh Thutmose the First, he is the grandfather of Thutmose the Third, who we talked about in class. He gets to Kush's capital, a city called Kerma, and burns it to the ground. And this starts a time period where Egypt is going to rule over Kush for 500 years. Long, long time. And during this occupation, Egypt doesn't consider Kush to be like a colony of it or that kind of thing. They consider Kush to be part of Egypt. They even solidified the relationship by building a temple there for the god Amun-Ra. Now, Egypt might have thought for these 500 years Kush is part of Egypt, but Kush did not think that. They felt like they were being occupied. So Kush finally is able to succeed at rebelling. And not only after 500 years do they rebel, they march deep into Egypt and they take over Egypt for about 70 years. Now, we don't know a lot about this time period of them in control of Egypt. Shocker, Egypt does not gloriously write about this time period. But that's some of the artifacts we found in Kush. We found documents and records saying that Kush actually had control of everything for 70 years. Now, after that 70 years, Egypt then rebels against Kush, and Kush goes back to its own territory. Now, another factor in this is that when the Assyrians come in and take out the Egyptians, they also destroy a lot of the historical records from this time. For the next 1,000 years, so like while the Assyrians conquer Egypt, Kush is left alone for the next 1,000 years. And eventually, they get conquered by a group in Ethiopia over here. Is eventually going to conquer them, ending their civilization. Now, another key to why we don't know as much about Kush as we do a lot of other civilizations is archaeologists and historians have not figured out their writing system. What we need is like a Rosetta Stone moment from a discovery in Kush, which could open up all kinds of new history about this region. All right, everybody. Next, we're going to talk today about contributions that Egypt delivered to the world. So remember, a contribution is something that somebody creates that benefits others. So the Egyptians, just like the Mesopotamians, invented tons of new products and come up with hundreds of new ideas. And one of their ideas was paper. So the type of paper they created was called papyrus because it was made from a reed plant, also called papyrus. So instead of telling you about it, I'm going to show you. So here's how you can make paper from the papyrus plant. All right, I like that part at the end. Hashtag this is Egypt. So that's pretty much how the Egyptians did it. Just one exception is they didn't have that. They didn't have that like press. They just hammered it again to get that. So that you could see how they made paper called papyrus. So question, what is papyrus made out of? The answer is papyrus. So this could be a crazy sentence. Papyrus comes from papyrus. I got my papyrus from papyrus. Like, it's just madness. So making papyrus also led to the Egyptians inventing ink so that they could write their hieroglyphics on paper, which is so much easier than carving it. So that's a huge contribution. The dry climate of Egypt preserved a lot of Egyptian writing that archaeologists and Egyptologists and historians can still read today, once obviously they figured out hieroglyphics from the Rosetta Stone. Now, papyrus also has other uses as well. The plant could be used to make baskets, sandals, rope, also boats, houses. Now, before you're like a house out of papyrus, for like the roof, in certain parts, but also like window shades, they use papyrus. And if you're like, doesn't the rain soak through? Well, as you learned in one of the Egypt videos, it doesn't rain too often in ancient Egypt. The Egyptians also make some further developments in math. So once again, as you're learning, it is the ancient people who are responsible for math. So if you are a math fan, you can thank the ancient Egyptians, and if math is your mortal enemy, you can curse the ancient Egyptians. So they used the number system based on 10, which we still use today, the whole like decimal system. They also figured out fractions and geometry. And if you're like, how'd they figure out geometry? Dude, they had to know geometry to build the pyramids. So that is definitely a math skill the Egyptians had. So they take like what the Mesopotamians did and go even further with that stuff. Now, as you learn, the Nile River flooded at the same time every year. So the Egyptians used that knowledge to make a more accurate and better calendar than the Mesopotamians. So what they did is they had 3 seasons in their calendar, and each season was 120 days each. And then they had 5 special feast days in honor of the gods, which gave them a grand total of 365 days. Now, that means their calendar wasn't as accurate as ours because, we say there's 365 days in a year, but technically that's not correct. There's technically 365 and 1/4, which is why every 4 years, it's a leap year, and we do an extra day to like catch up and like re-regulate ourselves. Yeah, because mathematically, a year is 365.25 days. So every 4 years, we do an extra day, February 29th, and that's what gets us, kind of staying on schedule for that. Oh, so that was, I apologize. I just got a text message if you heard that ding, but this is pretty funny. If you have the same like text message thing that I have, that like ding, here, I'll leave it on so it can ding again. I wonder how many of you are like, is that my phone? So we'll see. I'm gonna let it ding again because obviously, like if you don't check the text, it dings again. So I'm gonna mess with you and see if I fool anyone with that. So the reason the Egyptians only had 3 seasons is winter is not a thing in Egypt in terms of it doesn't get cold there. Well, it doesn't get too cold there. The desert gets kind of cold at night, but that's why they have 3 seasons, not 4. The Egyptians also made some advancements in medicine. So they are the first civilization to use splints, bandages, and compresses. So if you were actively bleeding, the ancient Egyptians could help you. You could get stitches in ancient Egypt. You could have your broken bones set. Now, not the kind of broken bones that like require surgery, but the whole like, having a cast or having your arm in a sling. Ancient Egyptians totally did that. So you would survive in ancient Egypt if you had those injuries. Now, speaking of medicine, let's talk a little bit more about Egyptians and medicine. So this is just a little kind of article I want to highlight. Some of you are like, what's up with this guy? You'll see why in a second. So, no, I don't want to do it like that. I want you to see it. So I highlighted some parts just to emphasize some things. So medicine to the ancient Egyptians was part healing, part magic, and part religion. Doctors of ancient Egypt knew much about human anatomy, that's the human body, and how to treat many diseases. They set broken bones, delivered babies, and prepared dressings for wounds. Now, just to give you an idea of medicine in ancient Egypt, what happened sometimes was this. Let's say you were in ancient Egypt and you had a headache. So you would go to the doctor and the doctor would give you a spell to read. And every, couple of hours you would read the spell, like, prayer to the gods. And so here's the thing. There was that second ding. Did I fool anyone? Did anyone just now be like, oh, is that my phone? If it was, got ya. And if it wasn't, you're smarter than me. Some of you are like, I don't have that ringtone. So anyway, back to this. So let's say today you had a headache. And I'm not talking about like coronavirus, like that kind of thing. I'm talking about just an ordinary, typical headache. There are obviously things that you can do to help that, like, Tylenol or something like that. But let's say you don't do anything. I'm not talking about the exceptions. I'm talking about like your normal standard headache. Chances are eventually over time it's going to go away. Well, in ancient Egypt, they're like reciting these spells every couple hours, and eventually that headache just goes away naturally. Well, the ancient Egyptians think the spell worked, so that's why they continued to do those things. Doctors would make ointments and medicines from natural ingredients like spices, herbs, animal parts, and plants like dates and garlic. And as you know, like when you're congested, certain spices can help with that congestion. Those who wanted to become doctors studied at temples and special centers that were called houses of life. After completing their training, doctors set up offices in their temples. And the ancient Egyptians believed that different gods and goddesses helped doctors heal. Hathor and Tauret, those are 2 different gods and goddesses. They are in charge of childbirth. Isis, remember the protector goddess, she especially was in charge of the liver. Treatment, as I mentioned, for an illness could be a combination of chanting a spell, prayers to a god or goddess, sometimes even a potion. And one of the more unusual prescriptions is crocodile dung, that's poop, and sour milk. Now, before we go there, no, the Egyptians did not eat crocodile dung and they did not drink sour milk. Here's what they would do. So You know how sometimes when you feel sick, after you puke, you feel better? Well, so what the ancient Egyptians would do, if you had an upset stomach, they would like mix the crocodile dung and sour milk and have you smell it, which of course would make you want to puke. And then you're like, oh, I feel better. And they were like, look, our smelling thing worked. So, in addition to taking medicine, an incantation that's like a chant to rid a person of a medical problem might be written on papyrus and then burned as an offering to one of the gods. Because they thought things like a headache was like a spirit was in the head, and that's why they would do these things. And then eventually, as the headache went away, they'd be like, our prayers worked because the person's headache is gone. So that's just a little bit more about Egyptian medicine. And that's a wrap on notes, part 6. Yeah, this one was much shorter.